ways of doing science. The traditional way, where you gather evidence and you use that to draw a conclusion. And then there's the underhanded way, where you're like, this is the conclusion that I want. Now let me find some evidence to support it. And it's actually kind of hard to tell the difference between the two. A lot of times you have to go into the methods or even the supplementary information to kind of figure out what's going on. And if you have a good story, and you can talk like you're giving a TED Talk, most people don't care to look any further. But this has real implications. Bad science has led to things like climate denialism, the anti-vax movement, and it's justified the systemic oppression of a lot of groups of people. Unfortunately, those things are not funny. So we're going to talk about Neanderthals instead. What do you think about when you think of a Neanderthal? For a lot of us, we have this idea of a brooding kind of meathead. The sort of fat guy at a barbecue who spends too much time talking about NASCAR. But what a lot of people don't know is that Neanderthals, on average, have larger brains than humans. They have a fairly developed tool culture, and there's some evidence that they had complex cultural behaviors, such as jewelry, music, and maybe even burial customs. And a lot of people don't think about where their idea of a Neanderthal came from. And it's actually really difficult to do behavioral reconstruction. One of the best ways is to actually look at the trauma. So if you have a lot of broken fingers, maybe you did something really difficult. Maybe you were a stonesmith. This is all, we're still the good science now. So this is actually one of the ways that people have been able to reconstruct behavior. And in fact, a really famous paper, again, still in the good science, a really famous paper figured out that the pattern of Neanderthal trauma matched really closely to that of rodeo riders. They had a really high rate of head trauma and a really high rate of arm trauma. And so everybody was like, oh, our views of Neanderthals are justified. Neanderthals were riding bareback on giant beasts, were single-handedly taking down animals, and were wearing unfortunate leather pants. But when you dig deeper in the methods, when you actually get into it, you realize that they only looked at 7 populations. They looked at 6 normal populations and 1 population of rodeo clowns. So I decided to help them out. And I actually did this. I was very upset during a class in grad school. And so I went in and I looked at 27 different sports that high school and college athletes may play. And I did the exact same analysis. I looked at what would be preserved on the bones, and I divided it up in the categories that they use and reanalyzed it using the same methods and including the original 7 populations. And the best fitting Neanderthal population, or the best fitting sport to Neanderthal populations, it makes a lot of sense. And it turns out that when you go looking for evidence to support a hypothesis, you absolutely find it. So let's deconstruct the complicated art that is cheerleading. What does it mean to be cheerleading? What are we looking for in the fossil record in order to be able to see evidence of cheerleading? And so I've broken it down into 3 categories, and I'm going to show you evidence of all 3 categories that happen in Neanderthals. First of all, we need evidence of vocalization. Second of all, we need evidence of symbolism. And finally, we need evidence of complex coordination that can be discovered in teamwork. Most importantly, if we use modern cheerleaders as an analog, you don't need to be cheering for any sport. So we're not proposing Neanderthal football players or soccer players. It is just cheerleading. So, vocalization. What was really shocking to find when I started breaking it down is that not only did I find evidence to support my initial hypothesis, but I was able to actually answer a lot of long, unanswered problems reconstructing Neanderthal behavior. So when it comes to vocalization, we look at the hyoid. It's a bone right about here, and it's one of the bones where a lot of our speech muscles attach. And so if you look at the difference between a chimp and a human, their hyoids are very differently shaped, and that corresponds to speech. The Neanderthal hyoid is very, very similar to that of a modern human, which has led many people to think that maybe Neanderthals are capable of speech. There's just one problem. When you look at the tongue, Neanderthals have a much longer palate and don't have the same muscle attachments that we see in modern humans. And therefore, people have been wondering whether or not Neanderthals have the ability to create all of the different phonemes that we see in modern humans. However, if we think of chanting, and not necessarily chanting words, but just chanting symbols, does it matter what they're saying, or does it matter that they're saying it? This may be the missing link, so to speak, between no speech and speech. So I think vocalization definitely happened. Next, we have to talk about symbolism. So as I mentioned before, Neanderthals have a much larger brain than modern humans, on average, but it's been really unclear whether or not they have the capacity for symbolic thought. Because we don't see them doing some of the things that modern humans are doing at the same time. We don't see evidence of large-scale hunting parties. But what we do see is we see some evidence for art. And I'm going to argue that the fact that they have large brains means that we're capable of symbolic thought, and we're capable of understanding simple metaphor. They just chose to wear it literally on their chest. There is no subtlety in the symbolic culture of cheerleading. And it is definitely within the range of what a Neanderthal would be capable of. Now, I'm going to take a really fun little twist here. And this is something that happens a lot in evolutionary biology. I'm going to stop arguing that there's evidence for it and start kind of assuming there is evidence for it and talking about why it would be adaptive. And in order to see whether or not there's evidence of teamwork, we're going to look at evolutionary game theory. Now, when two groups are competing with one another for the same resource, evolutionary game theory tells us that there are different ways of that kind of competition happening. If you have a violent encounter, yes, there will be winners and there will be losers, but both sides will pay a very high cost. Conflict of this nature has incredible cost. And when you think of the Neanderthal group size, which were very, very small, they probably could not stand to have those kind of high costs. We also, when we look at DNA evidence, we see that actually Neanderthals don't have the genes that are associated with aggression in humans. So instead, we see, and I would like to point out that these Mousterian tools, long thought to be things that people would walk up to a woolly mammoth and try to take down, were probably just early pom-poms. And there's another benefit to cheerleading. If you've ever noticed, a lot of cheerleaders look alike. And it would lead to in-group cohesion. So if you need to do cooperative acts, chanting and cheering together would help build up your cohesion. So, finally what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a typology. Because it turns out that cheerleading not only evolved with Neanderthals, but changed over time. And I've been able to identify 3 distinct periods of Neanderthal cheerleading. So we have early stage cheerleading that happened early on in Neanderthals. And you know what? Their cheers and their chants, really not anything to look at. Their stunts were basic at best. But it turns out that this was a transformative period. Because going from conflict to ritual display of this sort cannot be overstated. Now, mid-stage Neanderthal cheerleading, this is where it's at. The rules got much more, were much more codified. There were actually rules. The Mousterian tools were so alike in this period that it's likely that they were weighed before competition. There was an increase in Neanderthal sexual dimorphism, and this is probably because the women wanted to be small to be on top of the pyramids, and the men wanted to be large to be able to hold them up. And then, after there was contact with humans, they decided to add in all sorts of new tools to try and make their cheerleading be more and more complex. Unfortunately, for the Neanderthals, that complexity had a cost. Because they started doing more and more ridiculous stunts, trying to top one another, and even though initially they had been able to withstand the costs associated, they've been able to reduce their costs from conflict, these stunts were becoming so complicated that there was so much trauma that it actually led to small groups and eventually the dying out of the Neanderthals. Now this has been a problem. It's so exciting to finally have been able to figure this out because Neanderthals died out during a war period. And people have been wondering over and over how this would have happened. But I think that we can pretty conclusively decide that this is an accurate representation of Homo neanderthalensis. Now, finally, I have worked painstakingly with a group of colleagues to be able to reconstruct what an ancient Neanderthal cheer might have looked like. So we are going to present to you our Neanderthal cheer.